Very good afternoon to you all, and welcome to Ravel and Rachmaninov, two of the most popular composers of the 20th century, and apparently two completely different composers. I'm going to talk a lot about similarities between the two that may not be apparent, but first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about being typecast. We all know the dangers as an actor or an actress if you're in a soap opera and you get labelled as being Deirdre, who sadly passed away recently, or Hilda Ogden or whatever. But in composition terms, the same thing can happen. Elgar was very, very upset in the end that everybody played Pomp and Circumstance #1. And Debussy, likewise, with Claire de Lune, found that that was the piece that the popular man on the street would always think of when his name was mentioned. With Rachmaninov, we have a piece that became known as the It Prelude because it was asked for so often as encores at the ends of recitals. People would say, "Go on, play it." And they meant, of course, the famous prelude in C-sharp minor, which he wrote very early on as a teenager in Russia, and which is a wonderful piece, but which Rachmaninov became very resentful of simply because everybody asked for it. In a sense, it epitomizes everything that we love about Rachmaninov and everything that we identify with the composer in its few pages. It's remarkable that something written so early on could be so individual and so clearly part of the composer's style. I think as well what's wonderful about the C-sharp minor prelude is its evocation of bells at the climax. I'm going to play you a bit of the climax first of all. So this is Rachmaninov, the typecast in a sense, the It prelude if you like, but a wonderful, incredible, monumental sense of sonority and pianism at the climax. I certainly never get tired of it at all. But his leg was pulled by colleagues. Vladimir de Pachman, the famous eccentric pianist who used to milk cows to keep his hands supple, when he discovered that Rachmaninov was in the audience of his recital, he played the opening octaves of the Rachmaninov prelude in C-sharp minor, staring at Rachmaninov, and did this. He went, Chopin impromptu, fantasy impromptu. It was also known as the Brooklyn Prelude because everybody from Brooklyn at one time in the 1950s seemed to learn the piece. So what is Ravel's equivalent of the It Prelude? It's actually the Pavane for a Dead Princess, which Ravel apparently grew to detest very much as well, and who said to a pupil that the tune was repeated too often. But it's such a beautiful, gorgeous tune that I think it deserves to be repeated as many times as you wish. I won't play all that, but I'll play the... And like the C-sharp minor prelude, as soon as the opening bars are played, you realize that you're listening to Ravel. There are qualities there relating to modality. Ravel often uses the Aeolian mode instead of A minor. He often loves parallel chords. He loves added ninths and sevenths, and he's very fond of missing off leading notes, which is quite unusual. But these things mark the personality of the composer themselves. So, and I think Ravel wasn't being entirely honest saying that he resented the Pavane, because much later in life he orchestrated it, and it was certainly even more famous in the orchestral version than in the solo piano version. But those two works became kind of cliches of the composer, and there's much more to them. Of course there's much more to Ravel and to Rachmaninoff than two popular trifles, two miniatures. Let's just talk a little bit about the biographies of each, first of all, before we go any further. They were born within 2 years of each other. Rachmaninoff, 1873. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth from an old aristocratic family with military connotations, but who also had a love of amateur music making in their midst. So you can imagine that the horror of the 1917 revolution must have absolutely turned his world the other way around. And Rachmaninoff, he went to the conservatoire. He went to St. Petersburg Conservatoire and then to Moscow. He was a classmate of Alexander Scriabin. Scriabin, of course, this year is the centenary of the death of Scriabin. Apparently, Rachmaninoff got higher marks in his harmony class than Scriabin, but they were certainly good friends. And after Scriabin's death, Rachmaninoff gave all Scriabin recitals in his memory for a while. But he studied piano with Alexander Silotti and Nikolai Zverev, and composition with Arensky and with Taneyev. Taneyev, of course, was a virtuoso at writing counterpoint and fugues, a great technician. And Arensky, some of his music is still played today, very, very beautiful as it was. The premiere of Rachmaninoff's first symphony at the age of 24 caused a complete breakdown because of the terrible criticism, unfair criticism, that it received. Before that first symphony, he was writing furiously, demonically, an enormous number of compositions. But after the first symphony's premiere, there was a 3-year break. And very famously, he had to go for hypnotherapy. And he dedicated the second piano concerto in memory of his hypnotherapist, or in homage to his hypnotherapist for breaking him free, if you like. After the second concerto, works flowed from his pen very freely, including the cello sonata, the second suite, and so on. And everything was going very nicely. He didn't see himself as a concert pianist. He was a conductor, he was involved with the opera, he was a professor, he was a composer, and he had his world in Moscow. That's what he did. But with the incredible revolution in 1917, as I say, his world was turned upside down. It's stuff of Hollywood films. He fled in an open sleigh to Helsinki with hardly any personal belongings at all. And for a year or so, he lived in Scandinavia. Finally, he managed to flee Scandinavia across the Atlantic to America, and the rest is history. He made his fortune in America as a concert pianist. I think it's very, very interesting to remember that Rachmaninoff in America was practicing Czerny studies. Now, young pianists today generally dread and loathe Czerny studies and say, well, what's the point of practicing them? Well, if Rachmaninoff had to practice Czerny, I'm sure young pianists at the Royal Northern College of Music and at Cheetham School of Music should also be practicing Czerny studies. And he made his income for his family, for his livelihood, by being a pianist. That's what he did to earn money. One of the really, I think, harrowing facts that we all tend to forget about Rachmaninoff is that from fleeing from Russia until the end of his life, he only wrote 6 opus numbers. Now, that's incredible. From 1917 to 1943, there are only really 6 major works. There are lots of transcriptions that he wrote for playing in recitals of various things, but there are only 6, whereas before 1917 there's this enormous amount of work. So the man clearly was incredibly traumatized by moving to the West, and you know, Stravinsky famously referred to Rachmaninoff as 6'4" of Russian gloom. And we have this image, really, or I have this image of an artist who was playing for his livelihood and missing his homeland. And that nostalgia, certainly we can hear in works, even in works that were written before the exile period. In retrospect, they seem to have a wonderful melancholic sense of nostalgia. And perhaps it's not just for Russia, perhaps it's for the 19th century. Perhaps it's a longing for an era that has passed. perhaps the era of his ancestors and his past generations he's longing for in his music. So he had this career playing around the world. What is really wonderful for us is that he found a home in Switzerland, a summer retreat in the 1930s. And it was wonderful for us because staying in this summer retreat inspired him once more to composition. And in the 1930s, the works that came from him show a definite change of style. There's certainly more than a whiff of jazz and Hollywood in the Rhapsody theme of Paganini, and even in the symphonic dances, his very last work. But the writing becomes much more economical. There's much more rhythmic syncopation and sophistication than in some of the earlier works. But the beautiful melodic flow, the incredible luscious harmony remain there. So works from the 1930s onwards, we think of the symphonic dances, we think of Rhapsody theme of Paganini, and the Corelli variations in particular. 1943, right at the end of his life, he became an American citizen. But really, America was the center of his world after leaving Scandinavia and Russia. He lived in Beverly Hills. It's wonderful to remember the friendship with Vladimir Horowitz. And of course, Horowitz Gorovitz was his real name, but he changed it to Horowitz when he moved to the West because he thought it was more marketable. But Horowitz played Rachmaninoff's third concerto with Rachmaninoff's blessing. One of the really frustrating things is the fact that there were no recordings of Horowitz and Rachmaninoff playing two piano concerts. And these apparently took place privately in Beverly Hills in Rachmaninoff's house, and they certainly played the second suite and the symphonic dances. It would have been wonderful to have been a fly in the wall at one of those concerts, wouldn't it? But we have to think in our imagination about what that was like. However, Rachmaninoff did leave a number of significant recordings, including recordings of the concertos, which may surprise us today for being faster and perhaps different from what tradition, in inverted commas, or generations of pianists have made the pieces become. They're certainly well worth listening to. It's interesting, he recorded for Thomas Edison's label. Edison was going deaf by the time Rachmaninoff came to work for him, and he didn't think very much of Rachmaninoff as a pianist. He called him nothing but a pounder, which is ridiculous. But the recordings are wonderful. Some of them have been remastered. He also recorded piano rolls that remain for us. As a conductor, towards the end of his life, he restarted conducting again. The Philadelphia Orchestra, he had conducted in Russia, but towards the end, he restarted doing that again. So an amazing musician who was all-encompassing. He really was not only a great pianist, he was also a composer, and also a harmony teacher, a conductor, an all-round figure. But somebody perhaps who was playing the piano in public for the reasons of an artisan, not for any highfalutin artistic ideal, but because he had to do it, because he needed an income to survive. That's not to belittle his pianism in any way, but just to point out that perhaps if there hadn't been a Russian Revolution, he would have stayed on more quietly in Moscow and written perhaps many, many more works than he actually did. As it is, we're left with only 45 opuses. But because they're all so popular, we keep on hearing them time and time again. On the subject of typecasting and cliched words about composition, it has to be said that both Rachmaninoff and Ravel have had their fair share of mud slung at them. I mean, as recently as 1954, the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians described Rachmaninoff's music as monotonous in texture, consisting mainly of artificial and gushing tunes, and concluded by saying that the music's popularity was probably not likely to last. I also remember reading that after the British premiere of the Piano Concerto No. 2, the Times critic said that the concerto had no memorable melodies in it, which is extraordinary. We'll get on to Ravel's criticism in a moment. But I think it would be lovely to play a little bit of Rachmaninoff I'm going to play one of the quieter pieces, the Prelude in D major. I think with Rachmaninoff, there's a sense in my imagination always of musical pictures. There's an evocation of landscapes. He did, after all, write Etude Tableau, and I think the D major Prelude, Opus 23, number 4, certainly evokes a landscape. To me, it's almost like the Grand Canyon with a kind of, at sunset, with a bird of prey perhaps gliding almost to the point of stasis overwards. We all have our images in Rachmaninoff. That's my own personal image of this. It's also very interesting, the piece, because it has one enormous climax. And Rachmaninoff was very adamant that music should have one peak, one main point. And it's very obvious where this is in the D major Prelude. Thank you very much indeed. A little bit more about Rachmaninoff's style. Obviously, the influence of Tchaikovsky was huge, and the influence of Tchaikovsky would be huge on anyone of that generation. Certainly was huge on Rachmaninoff's classmate Scriabin as well, but perhaps even more significant for both Scriabin and Rachmaninoff was the influence of Chopin. I think that if any young student is looking for a PhD thesis, they could do a lot worse than consider studying the influence of Chopin on Rachmaninoff. The music is full of clues and hints towards Chopin's output all the way through. In one of the Etude tableau, there's a direct quotation of Chopin's G minor ballad, but it's very, very subtle, sometimes not even very subtle. Rachmaninoff's E-flat major prelude is clearly influenced by Chopin's Last Nocturne, Opus 62, number 2 in E major. The left hand of the Chopin Nocturne is a... Interestingly enough, I'd like to pay homage to Ronald Stevenson, who passed away 2 days ago. Ronald felt that the climax of that E-flat major prelude came a little bit too soon, and he did his own transcription of that, putting the climax at the very end. It actually comes after the first page. But it's interesting because the climax and where it comes is so important in every work of Rachmaninoff, and perhaps it comes a little too early. We have another 2.5 pages in that period. But certainly the point is that the Chopin influence is very, very clear. I'm going to play you another piece of Rachmaninoff before we move on to Ravel, and it's the Prelude in C minor, Opus 23, number 7. This is very, very clearly a homage to Chopin's revolutionary study. If I just play the end of the Chopin study, first of all, you'll see what I mean. Almost identical. So here's a bit of Rachmaninoff's C minor prelude. Thank you. So on to Maurice Ravel, born 1875. His mother was from the Basque region of Spain. His father was from Switzerland. He stayed for the first 3 months of his life in the Basque region and then moved to Paris, which is where he lived for most of his life. In the 1920s, he retired to the countryside and would come into Paris to socialise and to go to concerts. On a personal note, one of my teachers at university, Philip Radcliffe, actually had composition lessons with Ravel. And when I used to go along and take essays on Ravel, he said, well, I don't know, when I went to Ravel in Paris, I don't know if he would have agreed with what you said. But he did have there was a tradition of English composers of Philip's generation going to Paris and having lessons, notably Vaughan Williams. And of course, Vaughan Williams, you can sense the Ravel influence in his style. So there's that to it. But Ravel is quite a different character from Rachmaninov. His mother used to sing Basque folk songs to him in his childhood, and that obviously had a big influence on him. Think of the piano trio, which uses Basque folk tunes in it. His dad was very famous. He created an internal combustion engine. He was an industrialist, and he also infamously designed a daredevil device that was used in the Barnum and Bailey circus, a whirlwind of death, which in 1903 caused a tragic accident, a fatal accident. But this is his father, interested in machines. And that's very, very significant for Ravel. We tend to think about Ravel in a kind of label with Debussy as an impressionist, but he was fascinated by mechanical clocks. Think of the opera L'Heure Espagnole, and that is a significant part. Think of the Pavane for a Dead Infant. Clocks going all the way through. This is something that you can sense in all his music. Bolero, bum, ba-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-dum, bum, bum, right at the end of his life in the 1930s. That's incredibly motoric, isn't it? And even Jeu d'eau, the water fountain, you tend to think, yes, water. But I mean, what is a water fountain? It's a man-made device. It's not just something that's flowing from nature. And this is something that makes Ravel quite different from Debussy or from Liszt. Liszt, of course, wrote Le Jeu d'eau à la Villa d'Este, and people like Busoni were very bitchy about Ravel writing Jeu d'eau and said, he's just copying Liszt. Nothing could be further from the truth. Or Debussy's Reflet dans l'eau from Image is quite a different kettle of fish. Debussy was more involved perhaps with symbolism than Ravel. What does that mean? I don't know. But certainly Ravel was more involved with human man-made machines. And that's a huge element that comes from his dad. The Spanish element, or the Basque element from his mother, is also extremely important throughout his works. We think about not just the opera, but also a Rhapsody Espagnole for piano duet and then for orchestra. Of course, there's Bolero later, and there's Alvarado del Grazioso from Miroir. Now, I mean, not many people, I certainly didn't know what grazioso meant at all until I did a bit of research. I can thoroughly recommend this wonderful book, by the way, by Paul Roberts called Reflections. I think it's one of the best books written on any composer. But it's about the piano music of Maurice Ravel, and it's extremely inspiring and full of wisdom about not only the life but also about the music. But Paul, in his book, reckons that Alvarado del Grazioso gives you the essence of what Ravel's personality as a musician really is all about. On the surface of it, you think it's just another evocation of Spain like Chabrier, or like many other composers. I mean, Debussy himself wrote The Gate of Wine and the Soirée d'un Grenade from his stamp. But grazioso, what is a grazioso? The grazioso was a unique character from 18th century Spanish theatre, a kind of clown or a buffoon character who would never take part in the action, but would comment to the audience about what was going on in the play with a lot of humour, but sort of remaining slightly detached. Now, Paul, in this wonderful book on Ravel, suggests that is what Ravel is like himself, is in a kind of way watching this kind of, it's obviously very sensuous Alvarado del Gracioso. It's obviously very much a love dance, if you like, or a love picture. But Ravel is kind of like the Gracioso, watching objectively, or watching or looking at himself in a mirror in the work. And if you think about that could be a wonderful way to think about Ravel as a composer. Too often he's dismissed as being rather cold or detached. I don't think that's anything near the truth whatsoever. I think he was a perfectionist, he was an artisan, and Stravinsky very famously said that he was the most perfect of Swiss watchmakers, a kind of artisan, which is slightly cruel, but I think it does at least pay homage to the great perfectionism of the man. This is a composer, Ravel, who thought nothing of recopying by hand an entire manuscript just for a tiny single error that may occur in it. This is a composer as well who only wrote 60 opus numbers approximately. Not that many, and he was writing, unlike Rachmaninoff, he wrote consistently through his life. So everything that he did was considered and brought a great deal of care and attention to it. And my goodness me, it is rock solid, his work. I think one feels with Ravel's music that there's not a single note that goes to waste. He was a bit of an outsider. In that he didn't sail and glide effortlessly through the Paris Conservatoire. Far from it. In fact, he was dismissed twice from it for failing to win a prize or get a certain standard in writing some of the requirements for the institution. In the Paris Conservatoire, there's been a great deal of notoriety over the years concerning something called the Prix de Rome, which was an award given to an outstanding student, and which Debussy eventually won. And it was rather old-fashioned at the end of the 19th century anyway, because Rome had ceased to be such a centre of importance for music making in the early 20th century, late 19th century. But obviously earlier, with the era of opera, it had been extremely important. But Ravel entered for the Prix de Rome and wasn't awarded it, and it was a disgrace. But it's indicative of the sense of being a bit of an outsider that he always was. When Ravel was finally made famous and part of the establishment, when he was offered to be the Légion d'honneur in the 1920s, he turned this down. And I think that was symbolic of all the struggles he'd had with the establishment. Unlike Rachmaninoff, who was married and had a family, Ravel was very much on his own all his life. His personal life remains something of a mystery. It appears he didn't have relationships with anyone. He was certainly very much in love with his mother. He was certainly devoted to his music. But even close friends have on record accounts in which they describe a sense of frustration at the lack of warmth that would often come, the formality. He often dressed like a dandy. He was only 5'3" in stature, and he would dress, people said he looked a bit like a jockey, like a horse rider, in a sense. So an unusual character. Maybe he was dressing like a dandy to be different from all the bohemian artists at the beginning of the 20th century, and to be different from them all. I think as well, the influence of Gabriel Fauré should not be overestimated. Even though Ravel was dismissed from the Paris Conservatoire after 2 years of studying with Fauré, he was allowed to carry on as an auditor and sort of observe Fauré's teaching for a further 3 years. And I think that influence is extremely important indeed. Also, Ravel said that the musician André Guedalge was a huge influence on his composition. But I'd like to play you a piece which he dedicated to Gabriel Fauré after 5 years of studying with him. The lessons ended in 1902. And this work, Jeu d'eau, inspired perhaps by a man-made machine, a water fountain, marks a new departure in piano writing. There was nothing quite like it before. Debussy had written Pour le piano, which was not so innovative in terms of pianism, but this showed something quite different. And unlike Liszt's water fountain, which was very much a full-blooded approach in the Romantic tradition, this requires much more crystalline pianism, much more care, much more fastidiousness, much more delicate finger work. And there are new colours that come in to the equation that hadn't appeared before. So here's Jeu d'eau by Ravel. now we have to talk about the word impressionism. It's labelled and used for Debussy and Ravel. They're put together. The relationship between Debussy and Ravel started off extremely well indeed. The first suite that Noriko Ogawa and Peter Donahoe will play, the Auriculaire, is a two-movement work, very, very rare, written before the 20th century by Ravel, and Debussy asked to have a copy of it. And there's some lovely correspondence between the two composers. It became unclear at the time of Jeudeau which work was coming first. And the pianist Ricardo Wiens was a great common link between the two composers. He gave the first performances in public of Jeudeau and of the Image of Debussy. Sometimes in the same program he would play both Debussy and Ravel. And so he kind of brought the two together. However, inevitably, jealousies between the factions of Ravel and Debussy caused a rift, and they ended up not talking to each other. And there's a very bitchy comment from Ravel in which he says, double insult really, he says, if I had time, I would reorchestrate Debussy's La Mer. So he's sort of saying it's not worthwhile spending the time doing it, and it actually needs to be reorchestrated as well. Terrible. So it's a great, great shame, because they were very close in many ways, and I think they certainly influenced, and it's often unclear who came first. But I think it's unfair to call either of them impressionistic in a sense. Talking to Christopher Elton at the Royal Academy a couple of years ago, he suggested very, very perceptively that in a sense Debussy, in some of his works, was anticipating Salvador Dali, the surrealistic movement. And when you listen tonight to Oiseau Triste by Miroir, played by Peter Donahoe, I think that there's something very similar to surrealism there. It's so sparse on the page, a repeated ostinato left hand, and these whirling arabesques. It's almost like a Salvador Dali painting. So there's that to it. And of course there's the influence of symbolism as well. But what does impressionism in music really mean? It's not a direct tone painting. It's not like Rachmaninov, where you can imagine in your own private world perhaps an oil painting of your own choice. I think in Ravel it's evoking a certain feeling around an object or a painting or an idea. So in this water fountain, we're not actually literally trying to describe in sound the workings of a water fountain. Richard Strauss famously said he looked forward to the day when he could describe a teaspoon accurately in music. Well, that's nothing to do with Ravel's impressionism, but it's a big part of Ravel's makeup. It's not the only part. There's also neoclassicism in Ravel that's extremely relevant indeed. In 1904, Ravel responded to an advertisement in the Parisian press to produce a sonata allegro movement of no more than 75 bars in a competition, and he entered this. As it turned out, he was the only entrant in the competition, and if there had been more people, he would have been disqualified anyway, because the first movement of his sonatine, which it became, is actually over 80 bars long. It's not quite 75 bars. But having written for the competition this first movement, he went on to write a minuet and a finale, and we have this wonderful sonatine. It's nothing really to do with impressionism at all. It's the classical side, which Claire Hammond will explore more in her lecture-recital at the end of this series in the Bridgewater Hall. And it's a very significant part of his output. There's Le Tombeau de Couperin, which came in the First World War, a suite really looking back to the Baroque 18th century harpsichord suite, and using all the movements of the Baroque suite, and each movement dedicated to somebody who perished in the Great War. So there's this aspect to Ravel as well, that the impressionistic, if you like, Jeudeau came to a climax, I would suggest, with Gaspard de la Nuit. But again, it's not a direct painting. I mean, what do we have? A water sprite lulling somebody, or trying to lull somebody to their death in a pond, and then a body hanging on the gallows, and then a naughty goblin scraping on the window. I think it's much more than that. It's kind of trying to evoke the essence and the feeling around the poems themselves. and always with Ravel's incredibly acute, carefully considered, painstakingly considered compositional technique. He did say that my objective in composition is technical perfection. I can strive increasingly to this end since I am certain of never being able to attain it. The important thing is to get nearer it all the time. So whether he was in Daphnis and Chloe mode with the most incredible, rich orchestration, or whether he was writing the Mother Goose suite with hardly any notes at all, there's always this painstaking care and detail. He was one of the great orchestrators of all time. Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition would not be nearly as famous if it wasn't for Ravel's orchestration of it. But he was also a master miniaturist and a wonderful writer for the piano, and could, in just a few notes, create an amazing atmosphere. So I'd like to talk a little bit about similarities between Ravel and Rachmaninoff as we come to an end of this talk. I think that it's interesting the fact that they both wrote so little, but for different reasons. It's interesting that they've both been stereotyped a little bit. I mean, the Master Musician's book on Ravel, written after the Second World War, ends up with a ridiculous ranking of composers and says that Ravel could never be considered a great composer like Elgar or Sibelius, which is cringing now in its clumsiness. But the idea that somebody who isn't wearing their heart on their sleeve in a kind of big romantic symphony format can't be considered great. I hope that idea has long since vanished from serious discussion of music. I think also the piano was central to both composers' makeup. Ravel may not have been a great pianist like Rachmaninoff, but the piano was always there. He did win a competition playing the piano as a teenager. Both composers have earned a staggering amount of royalties for their estate. In Ravel's case, sadly, there was a bit of scandal after the death of his brother because he left no heir, and apparently there are millions stashed up in an offshore account. I'm not quite sure what happens there, but certainly in terms of popularity, you can't do much better than Rachmaninoff's Second Piano Concerto or Bolero by Ravel. They both had a sense of duality in their compositions. You can sense the neoclassical in Rachmaninoff in works like the Paganini variations or the Corelli variations, and you can certainly sense that in Ravel's Le Tombeau de Couperin and in the Sonatine. On the other hand, you have this kind of die-hard romanticness that you get in the Second Symphony of Rachmaninoff, or this kind of incredible post-Lisztian display of impressionistic virtuosity in Gaspard de la Nuit. It's interesting that both recorded and published and conducted their own works. Ravel very famously went on a tour of America in 1928 and conducted 25 concerts coast to coast. And allowing for inflation, the fee that he earned for doing that came to $127,000. Apparently he wasn't the most flamboyant of conductor. He was very economical and almost school teacher-like in his approach. But the trip to America had a huge influence on him. And there is a bit of jazz in the Rhapsody of Theme of Paganini, a whiff of Hollywood. There's certainly more than a whiff of jazz in the works written by Ravel after he was in America and after he came in touch with New Orleans jazz. If you think about the G major piano concerto, or if you think about the second movement of the violin sonata. So they've got that in common. The other thing is that they were both labelled Puritans by their contemporaries. Rachmaninoff's nickname was the Puritan with his colleagues because he stuck to the text much, much more in his playing than other pianists did of the period. I think we've got to remember that it wasn't so long before Rachmaninoff and Ravel that pianists would think nothing of playing 3 Beethoven sonata movements from different sonatas all together as a kind of Beethoven sonata medley. And even an artist as serious as Busoni would only play 2 movements of the Hammerklavier in a concert because he thought it was too much to play the whole work sometimes. Ravel was obsessed with the text. He was also a Puritan compared to many of his contemporaries. When Toscanini conducted Bolero and put a great big accelerando at the end, Ravel was furious. He wanted him to just do what was written. And I think Toscanini said it was irritating if he did that. And he said, but don't you realise I want it to be irritating? he saw Bolero in terms of a machine-like repetition, so that it isn't really music at all in a sense. I think that both Rachmaninoff and Ravel have incredible integrity. I like the word artisan when we're talking about them both. I think the fact that Rachmaninoff was singing for his supper as a pianist is a great tragedy, but it's also something that's very admirable. He was out there working. He performed in Manchester. After all, I've met people that heard him in the Free Trade Hall playing. And certainly the integrity of Ravel and not gushing out hundreds and hundreds of works, but taking such care. There's also a great deal of bells in both music. There's also a love of fairy tales. Interestingly enough, Rachmaninoff was not keen to reveal musical influences or pictures, but when in 1930 the younger composer Respighi agreed to orchestrate some of the Rachmaninoff Etude tableau, Rachmaninoff did reveal some of the musical, extra musical influences on the pieces. And of course the Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf Etude tableau from Opus 39, we call it that because of Rachmaninoff telling Respighi what it was about. And we have wonderful fairy tales in Mother Goose, Tom Thumb, where the pagoda's dancing when the princess goes in to bathe. We have Beauty and the Beast. We have the Pavane. So there's a love of kind of childlike love. I'm going to play you two pieces. We're running out of time terribly. I want to play you four pieces. I've got a lot to play you. But what I'm going to play first of all is two minuets. I might not play all the Rachmaninoff because we haven't got time. I'm going to play you the minuet, which is from the Ravel Sonatine, to show a connection between the two, the neoclassical side. But I'll play you the D minor prelude, a bit of that, first of all, from Rachmaninoff's Opus 23, also a minuet. So this shows the classical side of each composer. Here's Ravel, the Sonatine second movement. running out of time, so I'm going to stop there and finish with two pieces which I would suggest encapsulate the essence of both Ravel and Rachmaninoff respectively. First of all, a 1-minute piece, which is the Ravel Prelude from 1913, written for a sight reading examination, but incredibly beautiful, very simple but gorgeous harmonies underneath. Couldn't have been written by anyone else. And then the G minor Prelude of Rachmaninoff, opus 23, number 5. In terms of extra musical imagery and association, I think there's no doubt that the rhythm conjures up a feeling of war and drums and trumpets and brass. And the central section conjures up and evokes a sense of nostalgia. So you can make your own imagery. I think the imagery in Ravel comes in watercolours and pastels, and the imagery in Rachmaninoff, in my imagination, comes in oils and is much richer. So lots and lots of beautiful music by these two consummate masters. Quite a lot in common that one wouldn't necessarily think about, but a tremendous amount of variety. Certainly two deeply individual artists, and they deserve their popularity. I think they transcend their time, and they certainly transcend cliches and the crass judgments from critics in the past. So Prelude in A minor by Ravel, and then the G minor Prelude of Rachmaninoff.